On December 7th, that is. All right, so professional practices is going to be moderated this panel by Rob Moss, whose name has come up frequently here today. He's the Alley Moss, Rogers, and Lindsay, a shareholder and president, full-service law firm. We know them. Their office is in Palm Beach. He has an AB from Princeton. He's a big supporter of the marine industry, multi-year sponsor, omnipresent, and a major EBA and now YABA advocate. So, Rob, would you come forward, please?
Sorry. Good morning. When we first started planning the session, we had sort of different ideas about what we would talk about. But all of that changed when, in late October, there was a decision out of a federal court in the Western District of Missouri about real estate commissions. And one might say, well, why do we care? Well, the answer to that is that, generally speaking, certainly in the case of Florida, when a court looks to determine or rule upon a case involving yachts and yacht brokers and commissions, they look to real estate law as precedents. And the reason being that the real estate industry in Florida is much larger, so there's a much wider body of cases dealing with commission issues. And it's the same kinds of principles involved in that you have the law of agency, so it makes sense that that's where they would go. So this decision has caused ripples not just within the real estate world, but also within the yachting world. It involved a class action by thousands of property owners in Missouri against the National Association of Realtors and several large brokerage companies. And it ended in a verdict against the defendants, the National Association of Realtors and the two real estate brokerage firms that had not yet settled out with the plaintiffs, of $1.8 billion. And that decision is now on appeal, and since it involved antitrust issues, I believe, and we'll get into this, it's even potentially subject to a trebling of damages, so that would make it $5.4 billion. I'm not at all sure it's going to withstand appeal, having learned more about the case, but it's certainly something that is of great concern. So we will go into that a bit during this morning's session. And we have with us a very distinguished panel, which includes Melanie Griffin. She is the, here we are, she is the secretary, that means the head of the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, which includes the Yacht and Shipbrokers section, which has regulatory oversight over yacht brokers. So the buck stops with her when it comes to these kinds of issues. Sitting next to her is David Cully. He is a lawyer with Holland & Knight, and sorry, not sitting next to her, that's John Burkhart. At the end, sorry, is David Cully. He is a partner with Holland & Knight in DC. He heads their antitrust practice area or group, and he was the attorney in the suit in Missouri for one of the two brokerage firms. In his case, it was Keller Williams that was involved in that suit. So we have straight from the horse's mouth here. And then in between them is John Burkhart, who you've already heard from. I think probably everybody in the room knows John. He's the head of Allied Marine, has been for probably since I was a little boy. And so he's going to give us sort of the broker's point of view on some of the issues that are involved here. But let's start with Dave, who can give us a bit of background on the case and the ruling and possibly some of the implications. So, Dave.
Thanks, Rob. Let me just start for a second with kind of my background in this area. So I've spent the better part of about 20 years actually working on antitrust issues as they relate to residential real estate and multiple listing services in particular. And it's interesting to me to learn a little bit about how the parallels between multiple listing services in the residential real estate area and in the yacht area. I came to Holland & Knight in 2016 and had spent the previous 18 years with the DOJ's antitrust division, where I was responsible. I was in charge of an office that had oversight and over antitrust enforcement in real estate, and we were very active during the time I was there. We sued the National Association of Realtors at the time, sued MLSs. Since coming to Holland & Knight, I've spent about the last 5 years working on these cases that led to the trial that was brought in Kansas City in October. And so let me talk a little bit about what the case is and what it isn't. And first of all, I should say plural. There's numerous cases that are going on. There's been 5 new cases that have been brought since the verdict came out, including one in state court in Florida last week. And these are, like Rob said, brought on behalf of home sellers. There is a case brought on behalf of home buyers as well that's related. Let me just start with what they aren't, which is they aren't alleging a conspiracy to fix commission rates at a certain level. And that's been there's been some confusion in the press about that. There's this charge in the world that commission rates are all 6%, and that's not true. That's a misconception. Residential real estate commission rates are lower. That's not what this case is about. It's not about a conspiracy to fix commissions. What it's about is a narrower issue of a multiple listing service rule that says that listing agents, when they put a listing into a residential real estate multiple listing services, have to offer some amount of compensation to buyer agents. And it doesn't specify an amount. It doesn't say 3%. It says some amount of compensation so that buyer agents know what they'd be paid if they're the procuring cause of the sale and find a buyer. It had been interpreted to say it can be as little as a penny. And recently, some multiple listing services have been saying, you don't even need to make it a penny. You just have to put any number in there. It could be 0. The plaintiffs in the case say that no seller would ever have offered to pay any amount to the buyer agent. Why would you pay your adversary? And that was kind of the theme of the case. And they say that any money that was paid to a buyer agent inflated the commission rate that the seller paid the listing agent. And that led to this verdict that happened, I think, October 31st in Kansas City. After 12 days of trial, the jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned this $1.8 billion verdict. And so I think we're going to get into some questions about that, but I thought lay the background.
That's a good overall description. And so you had the issue of whether the seller would have paid anything to the selling agent, which to me is an absurd question, or absurd issue, because everyone knows, practically speaking, that's how it works. So the perceived evil was that the seller was being forced to pay this amount, but also was there an issue whether that then precluded the buyer from negotiating his own commission and potentially lowering the overall commissions paid, which presumably would then affect the price.
It wasn't an allegation specifically, but the explanation was that if the seller and the listing agent is paying the buyer agent, then the buyer has little or no incentive to, this was the allegation, to negotiate the commission. If from the buyer's perspective, the agent is effectively working. They don't have to come out of pocket to pay the buyer agent. So and it wasn't that there couldn't have been those negotiations. It was, the assertion was that the buyer would have little incentive to do that under the current system.
All right, which again, they were arguing would inflate the overall commission and thereby increase the amount that the buyer was paying for the property.
Right.
What I find, I can say strange, but kind of a bit troubling about the ruling is that these things that they're complaining about are inherent in the system, meaning it's something, practices that have been followed for decades, probably centuries, not just in the real estate world, but in the yachting world as well. So was the issue not the practices that were being followed, but the fact that it was dictated in the to participate in the MLS, the multiple listing system?
That's exactly right. In MLSs that follow NAR's rules, there was this mandate, and so that was what the plaintiff said: is why should it's fine if the listing agent wants to pay the buyer agent, but why should the seller have to pay it? Was the challenge? But you're right. In areas that aren't subject to NAR's rules, where there's not this requirement, listing agents offer to compensate the buyer agents routinely. There's good reasons for why that happens, and but it was cast that way to the jury, which is, why does this need to be required? Why does this need to be mandatory?
In the real estate world, at least in Florida, because real estate brokers in Florida are governed by a much broader, more intense body of statutes and regulations than our yacht brokers. But we now have the concept embedded in our statutes of a buyer's broker. And the buyer's broker is relieved of any fiduciary duties towards the seller or towards the listing broker. He is paid separately by the buyer. And that's still a concept that we don't have in yacht brokerage. And John, since you're on the front lines with these sorts of issues, do you see that as something that may evolve? Do you see a purpose for that in yachting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to evolve, just because I think, people are going to tag, our industry as well, or they're going to press this some. And I just want to say that I think, it's important that us collectively keep an eye on this. The IYBA board is definitely looking at this hard. That's why we're speaking here today about it. And we're going to have everything pretty much reviewed as far as our processes are concerned. And I do expect there to be some changes, not too many in number, but possibly a few things that we're going to look into doing, hopefully with our partner attorneys, to figure out how we can be protected from this. Our industries are still pretty different, only in that real estate, believe it or not, they don't have to do the kind of activities that we do as far as the amount of time it takes to do what we do is a lot more intensive, and therefore the fees have to be kind of different than what they do. And I find it interesting that they're poking realtors where the commissions are really almost so small now they can barely stay in business. This is from realtors I'm talking to. So I just don't know where this is going to go. But hopefully they're going to get that overturned, and maybe some positive things can come out of that for us. But definitely as a group, rest assured that we're going to be looking at this hard, and that's why we're here. So,
what's your view, your personal view though, of the concept of a buyer's broker? We have a broker that is working solely for the buyer. He's paid by the buyer. Do you see that as a positive, a negative?
Well, the only thing that I don't like about it is when a buyer knows the commission is going to be reduced, they typically want to pay less. And that's kind of how we got to where we are, where it's important that the seller pay the commission totally, because I mean, we, as a group, we can do it for a penny, like you're saying, or it can be 10%. I've seen commissions go even higher with a possible bonus sometimes. And when it becomes the buyer's business, the way they want to dictate the sale at that point almost becomes completely crazy. And so I think the setup that we have now, yeah, I would like to see that continue forward. There's been some attempts to have buyers, brokers in our industry, and it really hasn't taken hold at all because it's proven to be disastrous. You know, again, this may have to change that way, but I'm hoping that it doesn't, because we are very much a self-regulated group, even though the state of Florida is on top of it, of course, but they know we do such a good job in this area. In other words, we have these areas of cooperation. We have attorney looking at everything that we do. The state's looking at everything they do. Melanie shows up for every single thing that we ask her to. She's very involved in all of this stuff. We have some super ongoing programs looking at Chapter 326 right now that'll probably maybe help us all out in some areas, some changes coming forward there. Hopefully, that'll be for the betterment. Not too much regulation, but just, you know, that's my opinion, I guess.
Well, my view of it is that I think it is universal that the buyer understands that the seller is paying his broker, that he's not, somebody is, it's coming from the seller. So the buyer is aware of this, you know, call it a conflict if you wish, yet it doesn't seem to affect that relationship, meaning the buyer, good selling brokers are always looking out for the interests of their client, which is, in their view, the buyer, not the seller. And similarly, buyers understand that there is this conflict, and they certainly can take that into mind when they're listening to advice received from the selling broker. So to me, it's really more of an issue of disclosure, that people know what's happening. And I think they do. But.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you look at our forms, I think it's paragraph 5 in there where it talks about how fiduciaries are created in there. It's plain as day, you know, that when you have two agents, the fiduciaries go to the client that they're representing, whether it's the buyer or the seller. And so it sets it up to be, you know, set where, hey, look, I'm representing the buyer,
yep,
and the other broker is representing the seller, and this is how it's going to go head to head. I really don't see collusion between brokers, between buyer and seller, and saying, you know, hey, how can we do this? Believe me, I don't think you'd last very long in the industry.
No, I
if you were
agree
going
with
that direction.
Completely, yeah.
And truly, it's a tribute to everything that we've done to this point.
I'd say the same thing happens in residential real estate, where sure, the buyer agent is the one is paid, typically receives compensation from the listing agent and from the seller, but the buyer agent wants to act in the best interest of the buyer, because real estate agents make careers out of repeat and referral business and satisfied customers. And if you start to do things that seem shady, you're not going to be in the business.
Yeah, word gets
long.
out. Yeah. Let me just say riff a bit on what John was saying about the EBA contract, and it's an important point, and that is that under the common law, I mean, common law is the law that governs, absent a statute that covers the same subject, the listing broker, of course, owed fiduciary duties towards the seller. Fiduciary duties means that he had a duty of loyalty. It's like a trustee almost. It was a special relationship. And the listing broker was authorized, unless his client, who never would say you can't do this, to go out and speak to cooperating brokers, who we in the industry called selling brokers, about possible interest in the boat. And that selling broker is a sub-agent of the listing broker, and therefore owed the same fiduciary duties to the seller, duties of utmost loyalty and trust and full disclosure, and so forth, which is, when you're then representing a buyer, makes for a very awkward relationship. And I think a lot of brokers just aren't aware that, at least under the common law, that that was the case. But what EBA has done, as John mentioned, through the form contract, is inserted in paragraph 5 language that says when the seller has a broker and the buyer has a broker, that the listing broker is working exclusively for the seller. The buyer's broker is working exclusively for the buyer, even though the buyer's broker is paid by the seller. And that language is very important. So if any of you are not using the EBA form, I mean, it's not universal, hopefully it's getting there, that's an important point to recognize, because it's a trap for the unwary in terms of if things go wrong and the buyer can then later contend that you hadn't disclosed the fact that, or that you were, or the seller later contends, I should say, that you were working against my interest as buyer's broker. He has a point, because absent that kind of language, you can't. You owe all your duties to the seller. So, and Melanie, a question for you, as we were just discussing, in the real estate industry, you have to take an exam to become a real estate agent in Florida. There's a multi-page section of the Florida statutes that governs real estate brokers. There's regulations, extensive regulations, and we, with respect to yacht brokers, have Section 326 of the Florida statutes, which is relatively short, a couple of pages, and a couple of pages of regulations. Yes, brokers have to be licensed, but they don't have to take a test to be licensed. It's a much less intense set of requirements. Do you see that changing over time, or do you think that the state, the legislature is, not that they focus on it constantly, but do you think that they're satisfied, or are you satisfied that the level of regulation we have in Florida over yacht brokers is sufficient?
So I'm going to preface this answer by saying I am an attorney by background of 16 plus years. So I am going to get to your question. I'm just going to get a few remarks that are non-responsive, but I promise I'm coming to you. First, just want to let you know, you guys have amazing representation at the state level up in Tallahassee. I know Paul Flannery, your executive director, has just done such an incredible job of not only connecting with members, but importantly, also advocating behind the scenes to the staff who often have significant input with the turnover in the legislature due to term limits. So just wanted to applaud you and your organization for the advocacy efforts you have at the state level. With that, I also want to thank you for all the feedback that you have given to the department. I left the August conference on the West Coast with a laundry list, so to speak, of some things to look into, and our Chief Performance Officer, Chris Willenbring, was a huge help in following up on some of those claims and making sure the processes were better. And so want to put that out there on the East Coast as well at this summit, is that if we can help you, if there's something that's not running well at the department, we are making strides every day to make sure that we live up to regulating efficiently and processing fairly. But certainly all foundations can continue to be improved. So if there's something we can help you with, please let myself know, or I'm also here with Jesse Christian. Jesse, you want to say hi? So please flag down Jesse, me. We'd love to take your questions, concerns back. With that, what I will tell you is that I almost had a heart attack reading one of our vacancy reports recently, because the division under which yacht sales and brokers falls, I think had reached almost a 35% division-wide vacancy rate. Wow. Which is high, very high. The department overall enjoys a very healthy vacancy rate that usually is right around like 12, 13%, maybe a little bit above the private sector, but not much. We really do a good job of recruiting and retaining our staff. I'm proud to tell you that they are down to 6 positions that are vacant for well over 100 positions. So they have that down. So the bad news is we have some people we're training, right, that don't have their sea legs yet. pun intended, ha ha ha. Anyway, the yacht brokers, sea legs, get it? Anyway, but I'm not gonna switch to being a comedian. But the good news is that those positions are filled. So I think that some of those issues that we're having some trouble with getting phones answered, I think are going to be naturally corrected. Doesn't mean we don't want the feedback, it just means that hopefully the services will continue to improve. So to your question that I promised to answer, that said, I think that I can't speak for the legislature, but what I know from the legislature is that, as you may know, around 2019, when Governor DeSantis first assumed office, there was a big event called Deregathon, and the top state leaders generated big ideas of how we could make it easier to do business in the state of Florida. And then all of those ideas were packaged into 2020 legislation that were passed. And so when I first became secretary almost 2 years ago on January 1st of 2022, I thought, man, I need to get me a deregathon and make a splash like they did before. And what I came to quickly realize is that for both sides of the aisle, there is a yin and a yang to deregulation, that we want to make it as easy and business friendly to do business as possible in Florida, and yet we want to protect consumer safety and make sure that there is no Floridian harm. And so with that, then, I think that there's at least two things that are going on in terms of regulation of real estate versus yacht brokers. First of all is that with real estate, most likely you have more vulnerable populations that are potentially purchasing the only asset that they may own throughout their careers or their lifetimes that is supposed to set them up for retirement. So it's not that these aren't very large yacht purchases that mean a great deal to that consumer who's buying them or to the entity who's buying them, but more than likely it's not their only purchase. They're not going to be as devastated or financially harmed. Doesn't mean it's not important, but when you're looking at dereg and balancing Floridian harm, you're probably gonna see more regulation in the space where you have vulnerable populations, English as a second language, et cetera, where there may be more concerns about protections that are needed versus a sophisticated population that generally is served by your community. I think the second thing is that, and John, you took the words out of my mouth. I think you said something to the effect of that you are good actors who follow the rules. Those aren't exactly your words, but I'm paraphrasing. There aren't a lot of complaints about yacht brokers, so understanding there have been some isolated bad actors who absolutely deserve to be punished and should not be bringing down your good reputations. They are not the ones in the chorus sitting in this room. Those tend to, as I understand it, be isolated incidents. They're not replete. And so therefore, the better job that you do self-policing, which this community does extremely well, then the less need the legislature is going to see for additional regulations needed to put safeguards on your industry unless you bring those issues forth. And I'll come full circle then. And that's where I think Paul and his team do an extremely good job of explaining to the state, both at the department regulatory level as well as to the elected members, what you do and the significant positive economic impact you have on our state and why we should best support the yacht industry and shipping industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we just aren't as
vulnerable?
I guess vulnerable is the right word. I mean, there's less reason to select the yachting industry as a target for additional regulation because A, it's not perceived to be a problem because we don't have a lot of complaints, and B, it's something that we as a group are doing a fairly good job, apparently, of policing ourselves. And one thing, referring back to what John said, that certainly is the truth. There are bad brokers in this industry, but they are known generally by their peers and by other industries as people you can't trust. And that word gets out. So I do think that they are less of a threat and we are more aware of who they are perhaps than that one might be in real estate.
Well, and just one anecdote to think about the numbers too there in terms of you all knowing each other. I think if I remember correctly, there's about 3,000 yacht and ship brokers that are licensed by the state. There are almost 500,000 realtors. They literally represent a quarter of our constituency. So if you think about it, it's a lot easier to keep tabs on your community than on the real estate community.
Certainly, that's a good point. So fortunately, it doesn't look like we have more regulation on the horizon. So that's a good thing for all of us. Why don't we throw it open to questions at this point? I think there's a lot of important issues that we touched on.
While I'm working my way back to Jason, I'll come back up to you, David. Just so that everyone in the room is aware, are House bills odd numbered or even numbered? They're odd numbered, right? Senate bills are even numbers, House bills are odd numbers, right?
Oh,
I think that's
House
what
Bill
it is, yeah.
135. Yes,
So-
Jesse knows. I was thinking,
All right.
yes, you're right.
So Senate Bill 92 and House Bill 95 are in process right now. We've been through regulatory in the House. Regulatory referred us to fiscal and appropriations before it goes to commerce. When I was told that we were referred to regulatory, when I was referred to fiscal and then appropes, I asked why we were sent to fiscal. And the answer was because the state legislature wants to know the economic impact of not being able to license out-of-state brokers. So obviously there was some education that I needed to do. Our legislators have been educated on that because out-of-state brokers can't get licensed. So there's no approach consideration there as well. Congressman Rommel is the chairman of the Commerce Committee. He understands the issues, and House Bill 95, we fully expect, hope for it to land on the floor when session opens January 9th or shortly thereafter. Senate, we're already through committee and we're ready to go to the floor. So the two bills are in process to amend Chapter 326, the Yacht and Shipbrokers Act. And those 4 issues in the bills, I've outlined a few different places. It would take me time to go through all of that right now, but it removes the upper limit from 300 gross tons to recreational purposes. Gets rid of the grace period for bad actors to potentially operate for a 90-day period while they're being vetted. Allows brokers from out of state to come to the state of Florida and do business as long as they do so with a licensed broker in the state of Florida. And it puts different limitations on a person who wants to become a broker as opposed to a salesperson, mandating that they have to have experience and or receive 20 CEUs. And that opens up another issue and opportunity for us to enhance professionalism and consumer protections in the state of Florida through Chapter 326, the Yacht and Shipbrokers Act. So that's where we are regulatory-wise in working closely with the DBPR to make sure that we're not regulatory. Steve Moynihan generously donated his time to come to a meeting that we had with the governor a couple of years ago, and we proposed these things to the governor, and his answer to me was, yeah, Paul, these are all really great, but we're in a dereg environment, right? He had just gotten done with Halsey doing his trot around the state in the deregathon, and I said, you know, respectfully, sir, I don't see it as regulation. I see it as increased professionalism and enhanced consumer protection. And he kind of looked down at me like he was looking over his glasses, and he said, yeah, you're a good salesman, but that's still regulation. So we've gone the legislative route, and we feel comfortable that we're making progress. And just to remember, sure, we'd like to see more teeth in the law, those of us that are the good actors, but you don't eat an elephant in one big bite. It's one bite at a time. We move forward with this process. Jason.
And Paul, while you're walking, I will say that, as Paul knows, you did sail through your first committee with the proposed legislation this year. We did get a call from a member on the back end, and I think they were wondering why yacht brokers are regulated. And I think one of the most compelling arguments is that one transaction, I mean, a 10% deposit is worth thousands of dollars. So even though it may be a more sophisticated buyer, it still can be significant harm. And that's something that certainly resonated with that member.
Thanks, guys. I just want to go back to that court case that you started this with. My understanding is that as a listing agent, when I set the agreement up with the seller, he's agreeing to pay me that percentage. And then if I have both ends of the deal, I have the benefit of the full percentage. If there's another broker, he's still paying me that percentage, and our houses have chosen to cooperate with each other, and I choose then to take that payment that he's agreed to pay me and share that with the cooperating broker. So my fiduciary is still to that seller, and then I have a cooperative relationship with that other broker. Am I to understand that because of this ruling, the seller could then say, I don't want you to cooperate with other houses? I'm a little confused at where you think the evolution or the effects of that case could have on us. So that's my question.
So so what you described is right. The typical listing agreement between a seller and a listing agent says the commission is X, whatever they agree to, 5.5, 5, whatever it is, and that a portion of that, that it's disclosed to the seller that the listing agent is going to offer through the MLS a certain amount of money to incentivize buyer agents to show the house. If the obligation for a listing agent to through the MLS to specify the compensation to a buyer agent, if that goes away, I think maybe the plaintiffs theorized that listing agents will stop doing that. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that's the case. I think that listing agents recognize that buyer agents are providing a lot of services and value for them, and they're going to continue to want to do that. And the practice is going to continue whether there's an MLS rule requiring it or not. But you know, people generally theorizing about this do think that at some point listing agents might stop paying a finder's fee to buyer agents, and that will the portion of the money that goes to the buyer agent is just going to be lopped off the agreed commission, and that buyers will negotiate directly with buyer agents. I don't see the path to the evolution to that result. No. I don't know how that happens.
No, the absurdity of that as a suggestion or concept is that, yeah, I mean, if only the listing agent were paid a commission, then perhaps the commission would be less than where there's a selling broker involved, and the buyer therefore could get the advantage of that by virtue of the fact that the seller's net is going to be higher, or there's going to be less taken off of it. But the other answer to that is you only get paid a commission if you sell the boat. And without engaging or bringing in cooperating brokers, selling brokers, it's going to be, I mean, a listing broker would always prefer to sell the boat to one of his clients, but the fact is that there's a much broader world out there, and you're going to have to pay these people to bring buyers to you, and therefore you're going to get likely a better price for the boat. So at the end of the day, it enhances the seller's net. It enhances what the seller's receiving. It's in the interest of
the seller for the listing agent.
Absolutely.
To do that.
And to get back to the question that was asked, there's nothing that restricts a seller from agreeing with whatever terms he wants with the listing broker in terms of how much commission will be paid, you know, how it will be paid, et cetera. That's not the effect of this ruling. The problem with the MLS and the National Association of Realtors is the National Association of Realtors said you have to say in your listing on the MLS that you are going to pay the cooperating broker, the selling broker, and just not how much, but you will pay him an amount, which is sort of a ridiculous distinction because, you know, everybody knows that the selling broker is not going to be working for free, yet it was the fact that it was dictated versus allowed to follow based on custom and practice that resulted in this ruling. Is that correct?
That's right. That was the basis for the case, that there was a rule that mandated it.
Yeah, so one thing we have certainly learned, or the EBA has certainly learned, is that that's certainly the advice to members, especially now that EBA has is looking at its own form of multiple listing, is that just list the listing broker, list the boat, and selling brokers will know and understand that if they bring a buyer, they're going to get paid. And just leave it at that.
David, this is also for you. You said the Kansas City case was not based on price fixing. What do you think of the prospects for claims alleging collusive price fixing in real estate and yacht brokerage?
What do I think the prospects that there could be cases? Well, I've never, I mean, having, again, worked in this area for a long time, I've never seen any indication that real estate brokers are getting together and agreeing on commission rates. And so, I mean, you never know what plaintiffs could do, and I've never seen it. I've never seen any indication of that. And so, I hope the answer is the prospects are low.
One quick question. Since our multiple listing service lets us put them not available for co-brokerage, doesn't that almost exempt us from the ruling?
It's if the MLS does not require that listing brokers provide any, it's not like mandatory, it seems like these rulings shouldn't apply. It shouldn't have any relevance here. It was the mandatory nature of the rule that was what allowed the case to get where it got.
But the other thing I just wanted to bring up is we have a plethora of other cases that are sort of copycat cases because there's big money here. I mean, this was just 1.8 billion, and we're talking about, was it like 300,000 sellers in the state of Missouri? And if you extrapolate to the national level, it's huge, huge dollars. And I think that it's likely then that out of these cases, we're going to see sort of an evolution or a further development of some of these principles, some of these concerns. So this is kind of a watch this space, that there may be more coming. So we're going to have to be careful and observant as to how that evolves.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. There's a lot of people paying attention to the real estate industry these days, and you know, some of those same people couldn't be paying attention to your industry. And
yeah, I mean, once they've plucked that chicken, I mean, they may be starting to look elsewhere. And all I will say is that we are similar enough to the real estate industry in the principles, as I said earlier, that legal principles we follow largely come from the real estate industry. So this is not just a far-fetched concern. It's something that we have to watch carefully, and we have to ensure that we're advising members of potential pitfalls that they need to avoid and how we can do that, hopefully, contractually.
Just so you guys know, and so the entire audience knows, when this whole Missouri deal came down, my phone blew up a little bit from concerned members that, oh my God, are we next? So I conferred with the board, and we discussed with, actually some of the guys from Bob Allen's firm helped us to find an antitrust advisor. And that's how we met David. And David is going to take some of his time and energy to look through our forms and our practices and some of the things that we do as an industry and as an association, and advise us to where there may be pitfalls and how to avoid those pitfalls. So the association's working proactively to make sure that you, the members, are protected from these potential challenges. Rob, Melanie, John, David, thank you very much for your time and your expertise and a wonderful panel.
Thank you. It's a fascinating fact, 500,000 versus 3,000. Wow.